Probably one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in U.S. history is Brown v. Board of Education. But what did Brown v. Board of Education do, and what did it not do? All right, well, first of all, it did not get rid of segregation in our country. That's actually going to be done away with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's going to be signed into law by President Johnson. But what it does do is it's going to start whittling away. It's going to be a big chunk taken out of segregation in our country. Okay, so how does it start? Well, first of all, it starts in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. And that's important because Kansas was not part of the Old South. All right, that means that Kansas was a state that had segregation, even though it was never a slave state. All right, and in the city, there was an elementary called Monroe Elementary. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to walk through Monroe Elementary to see the classrooms that they were talking about. Well, Monroe Elementary was an African American, or what they called a colored school. All right, and so Brown, Lucretia Brown, had to walk to school or ride the bus to get to school. But here's the thing. She went by 3 other neighborhood schools on her way to Monroe Elementary. And her parents felt that that was unfair. They felt that the school system was not providing for their daughter. And so they sued based on the idea that separate but equal under Plessy v. Ferguson was not being adequately applied to their daughter's situation. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay, so Brown v. Board of Education. Brown was just alphabetically the closest, the first one, so it was actually a conglomeration of something like 6 different cases from 4 different states, but they would call it Brown because alphabetically it came first. And so they put all of them together, and they decided, they looked at a lot of different things to make this decision. All right, first of all, one of the things that they came up with is they said that separate but equal was inherently unequal. All right, Chief Justice Warren, this is one of his first cases where he's going to be the Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Prior to that, he was the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, State Supreme Court, where he desegregated all the schools in California. So now he's been appointed by the president, who is Eisenhower, and he is now the president. He's now the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And so this case comes before him, and he pins the opinion, and it was a unanimous opinion. All 9 justices said and signed off saying that separate but equal is inherently unequal. That it's impossible to have separate facilities for the races and still call them equal. The logic being that as soon as you separate the races, you immediately instill in one race or the other a sense of inferiority that interferes with their education. You tell them, whether you say these words or not, you tell them that you're not worth educating in the same way as another group. And he relied a lot on evidence from social studies rather than from social scientists, sociologists, psychologists, things like this, that rather than relying heavily on jurisprudence, on prior court cases. So that's probably one reason why he came up with the idea that Plessy v. Ferguson was wrong, was he didn't rely so much on these older court cases. All right, and so one of the things, for example, there was a famous study where they brought in dolls and they asked African American children which dolls were prettier, the white dolls or the black dolls, and almost universally they said the white dolls. The social scientists inferred from that study that African American children believed that they were ugly, or that they were uglier than white people, and that this was damaging to a child's ability to learn. Because if I'm ugly, or if I'm not as smart, or if I'm just somehow not as worthy of education as another group, then there's really less reason for me to put forth the things that are needed to be successful. Add to that most segregated schools, although Monroe Elementary was a nice school, it was in terms of facilities on par with the whites-only schools, which was another important step in this because they couldn't come in. They were not arguing that the school was inadequate. They were saying that the whole system was inherently flawed. All right, and so, but that wasn't the case. All across the South, most schools, if you go into segregated schools, for example, here in Lamesa, you went to the segregated school, Blackshear schools had last year's books, last year's jerseys, last year's desks, and it was never the same as the high school. It was never as nice a facility. If you go to Virginia, and I have seen some of these schools in Virginia, where we were in a place called Buena Vista, Virginia, and when we were looking at some of the places, Lexington, Virginia, and we went and we looked at some of the segregated schools, which are now shut down, they looked like sheds. They looked like wood sheds. And you're going, how do you educate 50 people in a shed that's maybe 10 by 20? And so there's no way you can argue that they were equal. But it doesn't really, but the Supreme Court comes in and says, you know what, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if all the schools get the exact same curriculum, the exact same textbooks, the exact same qualifications for teachers. The fact that you have separated this races means that you are saying one group of children are less worthy of education than the other group, and therefore separate but equal will always be unequal. As a result of this is called Brown v. Board of Education, and sometimes called Brown v. Board of Education 1, that it ordered the desegregation of all public schools in America. Now, I said this is Brown v. Board of Education 1. There is a Brown v. Board of Education 2. A year later, because so many states kind of ignored the Supreme Court, they came in, they revisited that case and decided that, yes, the Supreme Court does have the authority to enforce this order to desegregate public schools. Now, this is going to cause a lot of problems, and in no places is this going to be worse than in places like Little Rock, Arkansas. Central High School was a whites-only school. And again, I've had the opportunity, it's a national park, I've had the opportunity to go here. And it was a nice, brand new school in the 1950s when this was happening. And they were going to desegregate the high school. Now, their original plan was to desegregate the elementary kids and then desegregate, like, for example, the kindergartners and first graders. And the next year they were going to desegregate because they were already desegregated, and then just work its way up after a 12-year plan. But this proved to be very unpopular with a lot of the parents there in Arkansas. And so what they ended up doing instead was, well, we're just going to desegregate the high school. And in order to do that, they asked for volunteers, and there were 9 young people that volunteered to be the first African Americans to go to Central Little Rock High School. All right, and they're called the Little Rock 9. And many of them are still alive. You can still hear them tell their stories and share their what they call oral history. All right, but I'm just going to give you an idea of some of the things that happened to them. All right, first of all, they had a hard time getting into the school. Oftentimes there would be crowds threatening to murder them, threatening to lynch them. Many of them standing there calling them dirty names, the N-word, holding up nooses. They would, in some cases, they had trees. They already had nooses up. And so the first day, they were not very successful in getting in, so they went home. The second day, they try again, and 8 of them were able to get in, but one of them was running late, and so she had to go in by herself, which proved to be a very, very painful experience, in that she took a lot of verbal abuse. There's a famous picture of her walking in. She's got really dark glasses on, so since she wore the dark glasses, so people couldn't see how scared she was, and couldn't see if she started crying, if she was going, they wouldn't be able to see that. And behind her, there's this student just screaming at her at the top of her lungs. You could just see the hate in her lungs, in her face. Years later, that student would actually become friends with the Little Rock 9, and said, I was raised to be racist, and didn't realize how bad it was until years later, and how evil and wrong it was. So, but there was a crowd. They were threatening to rush the school. And so the marshals, the police that were there to protect the students, come up with this plan, and this is a bad plan. All right, they say, okay, there's 9 of you. I want you to pick one of you, and we'll send one of you out the front door. And while the crowd is beating or possibly even murdering that one student, the other 8 of you will be able to sneak out the back door and get home to safety. Now, to me, this is not a good plan, and to hear this from the people who are hired to protect me, it makes me very distrustful of the sheriffs. And so they refused, and they all got out together. But it was weird. You had students who were jumping out second-story windows rather than sit in the room with an African American, and it's almost surreal to picture what was going on. Later, the governor of Arkansas, a guy by the name of Orval Faubus, who was a racist in the extreme, orders the Arkansas National Guard to protect the school and keep the Little Rock Nine out of the school. And this is going to get the attention of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. You don't activate the military without getting the president's attention. And you got to come in. It's got to be something pretty big. Let me get this straight. You're activating the military, your little part of the military, to protect a school from 9 high school students. That's going to be a little hard to justify. And so President Eisenhower, whose record on civil rights was actually pretty good, it comes in and says, no, this is federal law, and I will enforce it, and I will enforce order. So he sends the 101st Airborne Division to establish order in Little Rock. They are going to be the guards for the Little Rock Nine. They will establish order and keep everything safe for the whole year. The next year, rather than allow segregation, Orval Faubus closes the schools. Now, I'm sitting at a place right now because a virus has closed the schools, and we're having all sorts of questions. But when he closes the schools, can you imagine being a senior and being told you'll just have to graduate a year later because your school doesn't exist anymore because I've closed it by order of the governor? This really, really angered a lot of voters, not just African American voters, but white voters who are going to, at the next May election when they vote for the school board, are going to throw out the old school board that supported this decision and replace it with people who are unwilling to allow something like this to keep their children from being educated. Now, first few months were pretty hard. The first year was very hard, but it's kind of a funny thing. According to one of the Little Rock Nine who made a video about it, within that second year, third year, things had settled down and no one seemed to care anymore. But I think that that's actually what many of the segregationists were concerned about. They didn't want African Americans to be seen by their children as just other kids. And they didn't want them associated with each other. And their biggest fear was they would start to date, maybe even marry and have children. And for some reason, the idea of a biracial child just absolutely freaked them out in the most extreme way possible. So that's partly why they fought so hard for this. They're going to lose. Arkansas was going to be desegregated, again, starting with the Little Rock Nine. But it goes back to that Brown v. Board of Education. Now, it's also important to note, as I did in an earlier video, Brown v. Board of Education was not the first decision that desegregated a school. That was actually Sweat v. Painter at the University of Texas, and that set kind of the pattern that's going to be used by Brown v. Board of Education to desegregate all these public schools. So if you haven't watched it, make sure you watch that video on Sweat v. Painter. Until then, I'm almost out of time, so stay safe, stay well.